Hello, everybody. This is Jeffrey Gomez and Stephanie Preston, and today we would like to introduce a conversation on certain topics within the realm of William Livingston's world and the era of the Enlightenment in early America. More specifically, today's conversation will dive into understanding the religious and ethical ideas that were shared and expressed by William Livingston, as well as other founding fathers, in an effort to understand how these things may have affected their personal views, as well as the founding principles of the United States. Before we explore these ideas further, I would like to thank Doctors Elizabeth Hyde and Jonathan Mercantini for guiding us through this experience and for motivating us to research these interests. I would also like to thank our fellow peers in the Honors History program for providing us with inspiration and aid when it was needed. Thank you.
Thanks.
So, today I was motivated to talk about William Livingston in a way that try to talk about his religion. And the reason I did so is because for some reason I felt that there was a connection to his religious life, to the way he conducted himself politically as well
Right.
as in everyday life.
Right.
And that's to be expected, I think, in everyday life because it was something that is common in that time, whereas you look at the way they write most of the times and you'll see religious things just thrown in there,
Right.
and it's everywhere. Religion is very central to the life during this time, whereas that may not be the case for as many people in the current day, but for some I can see it as still central to the way they carry their life, whereas for William Livingston that is definitely certain.
Right.
So in that, I started looking at, okay, so if it was something that was common during his life, what were the religions that were around during his time? And so I looked in basically at one of his pieces in the Independent Reflector, where he's talking about remarks on the intended college. The college in question is King's College, which eventually today becomes Columbia University. And in it, he's trying to argue for or in favor of a plurality in terms of religion. He doesn't want the college to be controlled by essentially one specific group or one religious sect. And when I say religious, really I mean Christian or Protestant Christian sect. So this is where I'm coming from in terms of trying to understand, okay, why is he saying the things that he's saying in this particular essay or sets of essays, because it's I believe it's 5 of them. But he goes in and he references actually a couple of them. So one of them was Anglicanism. So Anglicanism is the pretty much established the Church of England, and tends to be the majority religion in the area, and because they're mostly English settlers, some of them come from other places. So he was of Scottish descent, so he had ties to the Reformed Church, and so he started his life as a Dutch Reformed, which has its roots in Calvinism, but he later on in life converted into Presbyterianism. So it's not that much of a jump if you really look at it, because if you look at the central tenets of Presbyterianism, it's really Calvinism, just like the Dutch Reformed Church. So what he looks at is that he doesn't want the established one to have rule over the entire college, because he feels that it will in a way produce scholars or people going through that college that will think in the Anglican way.
Okay.
And he wants people to be looking at it through multiple perspectives. So on more of the religion, so I said Anglicanism, the Dutch Reformed Church, and Presbyterianism. But in New York, where Columbia University is, there's also Quakers, Lutherans, a Moravian church, the Anabaptist Church, the French Reformed Church, which is another Calvinist church, and Methodism, as well as others, but these
Right.
are the ones that I could find. But I really wanted to look at certain things that were also important or prominent in this era, which was deism. Deism, or natural religion, takes a role amongst the founding fathers when they start talking about God in a sort of ambiguous way. And we see this later. I'll talk about this later, because it shows up a lot in even in politics. But deism is sort of a unnatural religion, uh, in the sense that it's trying to understand a somewhat all-powerful God, this
Okay.
being, this divine being of God, that though I believe them to be based in Christianity, they're sort of taking it out in the sense of they're trying to add reason into the mix, whereas Christianity was more basically focused on scripture. They're
Okay.
trying to apply maybe science to the
Right.
existence of God. Now, I don't want to get into that because this is not a religious debate. That is not something that I want to do. But it shows that there was different kinds of thinking during this time, not just the established Anglican Church or the Church of England, which was very popular, but there were other different styles of faith. But I did want to go into Presbyterian because this was the faith that was so central to William Livingston. And if what my research leads me to believe is that Presbyterian definitely had an important role within his life, as well as like the larger revolution as a whole. So I was able to find 5 basic tenets of Calvinists, because Calvinism is not something that I am too common with, because I
Right.
was raised in the Roman Catholic Church, and
Okay.
William Livingston would have hated me. It's not a faith that I practice like fully today, but he would have just hated me because I was associated with it.
Oh no.
But they tend to abbreviate these 5 basic tenets as TULIP. So the first one is total depravity, which says that we as humans are sinful beings and nothing can change that.
Right.
There's more to it, but
Yeah.
I'm boiling them down
Right.
because I want to be concise about this.
Got it.
You had something, yeah?
And with total depravity, it also ties in with ethics because of Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan and how he believes that no human is this good person and that they need this government to kind of run them and show them the way. Otherwise, it's just going to lead into anarchy, which kind of tied into ethics and moral philosophy because it dictated how they acted with themselves and towards other people.
Yeah, no, it definitely it comes from a certain perspective. Hobbes, naturally believing that human nature is somewhat negative. It's
Right.
not something that is like we aren't born good,
Right.
essentially. And this is also a debate that happens with Saint Augustine and Thomas Aquinas. They're trying to struggle with like what is human nature,
Right.
and what is human nature? That is
No
something
one
that
knows.
to struggle with.
No one
And
knows.
so Hobbes gives us a perspective. His is less based in religion, even though he probably came from a religious
Right.
background, because all scholars really did in that time. But it's cool to see that connection between trying to think outside of the religious context.
Exactly.
But another tenet of Calvinism is the unconditional election, which means God, this divine being, chooses those who receive eternal life, and those who have been called to the faith are done so through God's will, meaning God chooses those. So it's sort of this idea of predetermination, essentially like fate. You don't really have this free will. It's something that God already had in a plan for you, or
Right.
something like that. There's also the idea of limited atonement, which means Jesus' sacrifice for our sins is limited to saving those chosen by God. And that kind of ties into the previous tenet, whereas like this is something that is already limited because it's already been chosen by God. He's already dictated who is to be saved, who is to be not. Now, we may not know that, but he already knows that. And this is something that, how could we know if
Right.
we're talking about a divine being like that? Another tenet is irresistible grace, which means you cannot be saved unless you are drawn to God through his grace, which I found sort of contradicting in the sense that if you don't accept God, but you can't be saved in a way. But all right, how is it that you can't be saved if God already chooses who's going to be saved, right?
Right.
Like I can't make that conscious decision. God already made that decision for me. Now that's I'm talking a lot of religion, and this is something that that I just wanted to try to get into the mind of William Livingston. And there's another tenet, perseverance of the saints. If you are justified by God, then your salvation is eternal. Um, and this ties into this religion aspect in trying to understand the world that you come into. And so I'm not sure if he was truly devotional to the idea of I have no free will or things are already predetermined for me. However, these are the basic tenets of Calvinism, which goes on to influence Presbyterianism, um, as well as the other Reformed churches, Reformed coming from that Calvinist school of thought. But he uses this idea that he has his own faith, but he's not trying to push it upon others. And so this really comes to a head when he's talking about the promotion of the college, the King's College, which is Columbia. And he wants it to be a religiously plural institution, meaning no one sect has control. So that pretty much, like you've heard that before, religiously plural, right? Because that is the basic tenet of America.
Right.
We want to have a place that is open to all peoples of all faiths.
Right. Liberty of conscience and to have an unmediated relationship with God without interruption from anyone else.
Exactly. So that's very much a central tenet of American. And though this may not be original to Presbyterianism or even to William Livingston, this is something that he was thinking. And if he came from that background and was able to think this, you would see that other founding fathers would, even though they may not have been Presbyterian, they would have also been thinking this.
Right.
So this gets applied to the college, but it's very much a revolutionary idea. Whereas in England, there was this idea of freedom of faith, if you're Protestant,
Right.
if you're Protestant, within that realm. But it's something that really is like not uniquely American, but very American. It's one of those central things that is part of America. And so I start to look at this and I wonder, well, why is it that he's thinking of this? So I start to look at like maybe what some of the things that he's reading. And I found 3 things. There's definitely more, but 3 of them that I thought were particularly interesting was Sharon's Wisdom. So Pierre Charon, and he was a French theologian, and he wrote a book titled Of Wisdom, in which the author argues in favor of questioning the established knowledge or propositions and exercising doubt in order to obtain wisdom. So essentially he wanted people to question things. Like if there was an established notion, you question why was it established? Is there an alternative? He wanted you to start thinking this. And I thought that was interesting in a way because he was a French Catholic. And so, yeah, that in a way, like, I know the Catholicism of that time was very restrictive on like what you should be thinking, and that's why the Protestants,
kind of no leeway.
That's why they're called Protestants, because they're protesting against this idea. So I was like, wow, this is coming from, and he's a clergyman as well. So coming from a clergyman, this is something quite different. And to find a Catholic, to find a Catholic within his library, that's even more because it was very anti-papist, as he would have put it. And another one was Smith's view of deism. And so I briefly mentioned deism before as this natural religion or trying to understand God through reason, science, that sort of idea. And it was something that was actually promoted by a lot of the founding fathers. I found connections to deism and Thomas Jefferson, even though officially probably would have been of the Anglican faith, because I believe in Virginia, Anglicanism was actually mandatory.
Oh, really?
Yeah, for a certain period of time.
Wow.
And like when they were born, they would have been alive during this time when it was mandatory. As well as George Washington, who was Anglican officially, but he did express some deistic views. And Benjamin Franklin is another notable one. And so this shows me is that he's trying to understand the people around him, right? Like he comes from this particular faith, but he's trying to understand people. And so he looks at this, and Smith is Adam Smith. He's more famous for writing his economics books, and I, I'm trying to remember what it's called. I can't. But
he wrote a book.
he wrote definitely influential Adam Smith in the realm of economics. And then another book was Pascal's Wager, and so this book I found was interesting in trying to understand the relationship that life has to believing in God. And so Pascal argues, you can put, I'm going to put something here that sort of describes the argument. But there's the argument that if you do not believe in God, but God does exist, well, then that means eternal damnation because you didn't believe in Him.
Right.
But if you believe in God and God doesn't exist, well, then that was just wasted time.
Interesting.
And then there's if you believe in God and God does exist, then you
Salvation,
know that's salvation.
pearly gates, all that.
And if you don't believe in God and God doesn't exist, well, that's a life well lived because it didn't preoccupy you at all, right?
Okay.
You weren't focusing on living justly. You basically lived your life the way you wanted to. So it's like trying to struggle with that idea of like
A lose-lose-lose-win
a
situation.
yeah, that sort of thing. And so this shows that he's contemplating like different ideas outside of his established like faith, right? Like because we could all belong to a certain group but not express all the ideas of that group.
Right.
Maybe we agree with some of them, but others I'm like maybe we're iffy on. So this shows the man that is like Sharon put out for us is he's questioning the established notions.
Interesting. I wonder what Pascal, like how that would dictate how he behaves in his normal life. If he has all of these different, sections with religion of if you believe in God and He doesn't exist, well then whatever. But if you, or what was it? If you don't believe in Him and He does exist, you get damnation.
Eternal damnation.
So I'm curious to see him and any of his followers, how that dictated how they go about their life and how they go throughout these obstacles during this time period.
Yeah, no, definitely. Especially in a time when, I don't think anyone was openly atheist, but being openly atheist would have probably been
I know,
if not a death sentence, exile.
If I'm not mistaken, a lot of people are called William Livingston an atheist for many of his beliefs. So
yeah, and
I feel like it was a very loose term with a lot of underlying definitions that no one really knew of, so they were just throwing it out at anyone.
Yeah, and that could be because he was questioning, things.
Not necessarily meaning that he doesn't believe.
Yeah.
He just has questions, which is all right.
Yeah, definitely. And they could have equated that to him being atheist.
Right.
Which, obviously was wrong.
Right.
Because if you look into the Independent Reflector, he has a piece where he states exactly what he believes. It's titled "Of Creeds and Systems, Together with the Author's Own Creed." And in this, he actually lists, sort of like Martin Luther I believe it's his 31 theses, explaining like why like he had problems with certain aspects in the church. Well, he does, I believe, 31 as well.
Oh, really?
But claiming all of the things that he believes in.
Okay.
And in looking to this is where I come to the conclusion that he hates Catholics.
Yeah.
But as well, and it's not that he hates them as people, it's really he hates the structure.
Yeah, the structure, what they believe, follow in, behave, act.
Exactly. And that's, he's anti-clerical, if we want to put it into more precise terms. So he doesn't believe in the hierarchy that is in place within the Catholic Church. But this is also that brings him into contest with the Anglican Church, because they also have a sort of established hierarchy within their church. They have priests, bishops, archbishops. They have that sort of system within their church. And so this is where he's often seen as in odds to the Anglican or the established Church of England. So, and he calls it episcopacy, but just know, I think the Anglican Church in America today is called the Episcopal Church. So it's just another term, really. But it's they're built on the same principles and they follow like pretty
Right.
much similar ideas. Okay. So just to show that I'm not just pulling these ideas out of nowhere, I want to show that these are some of the things that he's saying against the clerical or this established hierarchy within the church. So one of his, if you want to call them theses on his beliefs, is I believe many an honest man has worn a red coat, and many a rogue a black one. And so the black one is in reference to the robe that priests of the Anglican Church would have been wearing, as well as the Catholic Church. But I think this one is more specifically geared towards the Anglican Church because he also says a red coat, which it's very rooted in that English mentality of the church. And then he also says, I believe that when our Savior said, they teach doctrines, the commandments of men, he did not intend to confine the charge to the Pharisees. And so the Pharisees being, in the Jewish religion, they being the top people, the interpreters of the Bible, or to them the Torah.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to say what other books because that is beyond my
Right.
knowledge, but they're pretty much a similar version to the hierarchy that you would find in Christian churches. And so that's a reference to the Bible, Matthew 15:9, and he's essentially saying, that all the words that are in the Bible, it wasn't meant to be only interpreted by these people in power or this hierarchy. It was meant for people to sort of interpret them for themselves. And this one is particularly anti-Catholic. I believe the transubstantiation of the elements into flesh and blood by the mouth of a Romish priest being a Roman Catholic priest, to be equally possible with the transmutation of sinners and numbskulls into saints and scholars by the hands of a Protestant priest. So he is throwing shade to Catholics, but in it
Yes.
he's also throwing shade to any Protestants who have this established hierarchy.
Right.
Because if you know in Catholic doctrine, the idea of the transubstantiation or like the bread, anything being made into the flesh and blood of Christ, that is very central to Catholicism.
Yes.
And so that is something that a Catholic would have been angered by, him just mentioning that. But it shows that he is thinking about these things and he has his preconceptions, right?
Yes.
It's like not only is he against certain things, right? He may be looking outward to try to keep an open mind, but there's definitely things that he is completely against. So, and so to sort of tie all this in, I wanted to look, how did this idea affect the United States? How does religion, or his religion, how does the religion of the day affect the United States as a country? The founding of the United States. Why is it that religion had such an important part within the founding of the United States?
Right.
And so there are those who made the arguments during and after the Revolutionary era who stated that one of the principal callers for revolution in the Middle Colonies were actually the Presbyterians. And the Presbyterians, they played a major part in the persuasion in favor of the revolution. So these are other people. So this would have been coming from loyalist sources, people who didn't want the revolution to happen in
Right.
the United States. And they were saying, oh, those Presbyterians, they're the cause, at least in the Middle Colonies. They were the cause for like people being led against the king and, calling for revolution. So Thomas Jones, an embittered loyalist exile, identified the culprits he deemed responsible for the rebellion in New York, the Whig triumvirate of Presbyterians. He explicitly mentions William Livingston, William Smith, and John Moore Scott Jones, averred that in the Independent Reflector and the Watchtower, so these are two now considered to be pro-revolutionary writings, or collections of writings, the Independent Reflector being a sort of collection of essays that was, if not weekly, it was released in certain different times, certain different dates, as was the Tower. And they authored So they authored this, and the established church was abused, monarchy derided, episcopacy reprobated, and republicanism held up as the best existing form of government. The three wrote with rancor, a malevolence, and an acrimony, not to be equaled by the descendants of those Presbyterian and Republican fanatics whose ancestors had in the preceding century brought their sovereign to the block, subverted the best constitution in the world, and upon its ruins erected Presbyterianism, Republicanism, and hypocrisy. This man is very mad.
Yes.
So he makes even reference to the beheading of, I believe, King Charles in here. So that's where he's trying to say that they brought down their king. And because Charles was a noted Catholic.
Right.
And so, but this was an idea that they already had this established system, and the Presbyterians had a part, or like their ancestors had a part in bringing down that monarchy. So it shows that he's trying to attribute this revolution to, like, how did you not see it? The history was already there with the previous revolution. So
Interesting.
he brings in an idea that is somewhat crazy. But this is what he's saying. But you might also look at this and think, well, maybe this is just one man pointing fingers, right, at his political or intellectual rivals. But there are other sources like this that speak in a similar manner. And not all of them were Anglican. Some of them were from Pennsylvania. There was one, I believe, also from New York itself. But then I was like, well, let me look at the Presbyterian side. But if you look at the Presbyterian side, they give a certain speech. So this is accredited to the second president of the College of New Jersey, which is now today known as Princeton. And he made a speech. I don't know if it was a part of a sermon, but he made a speech. And the author of this article, who brings up this particular speech, he puts it like this. On May 17, 1776, a date that Continental Congress had set aside for prayer and fasting, Witherspoon preached at Princeton. After remarking that he had never discussed politics from the pulpit, he declared that the cause in which America is now in arms is the cause of justice, of liberty, and of human nature. That person is the best friend of American liberty, who is most sincere and active in promoting true and undefiled religion. Whoever is an avowed enemy to God, I scruple not to call him an enemy to his country. Indeed, the cause is sacred, and the champions for it ought to be holy. For in times of trial, it is in the man of piety and inward principle that we may expect to find the uncorrupted patriot, the useful citizen, and the invincible soldier. So he's elevating patriots or people pro-revolution
Yes.
to this state of, like, oh, you're like almost a crusader in a sense, that you're crusading for this higher purpose, a
Right.
purpose. I won't say that he's saying that this is God's cause, but it's a righteous one at least.
Yes.
At least in the view of his. Now, he doesn't represent all of Presbyterianism, but he's a second president of Princeton, which was founded by Presbyterians, so Presbyterian ministers, and they would educate many Presbyterian ministers to come after. So it shows that this is a bastion of this thought, and this is the way that the president of the college is thinking. So it's interesting to see that. And so that brings me on to my other point, is that a lot of the colleges during the time, and this is why I think William Livingston is arguing against this, they were headed by particular sects. So the College of New Jersey was Presbyterian. Queens College, which is now Rutgers today, was from the Dutch Reformed Church. King's College was to be decided, and that's what he was trying to make change of. I think the College of William and Mary may have been Anglican. I'm not too sure about that. I would have to check again. But It shows that all these colleges were pretty much bastions of a particular thought, a particular way of thinking in terms of religion. And so, with the founding of King's College, he kind of wanted to change that. And so, he argues in the sense that the true use of education is to qualify men for the different employments of life to which it may please God to call them. So, this is using God and education. So, this is an even further intertwining of things essential to life. So, 'tis to improve their hearts and understandings, to infuse a public spirit and love of their own country, to inspire them with the principles of honor and probity, with a fervent zeal for liberty and a diffusive benevolence for mankind, and in a word, to make them the more extensively serviceable to the commonwealth. And so this is something that he says directly to people in an essay.
Right.
He is tying the idea of religion and education so closely to one another, in that if you teach people a certain way, if you teach them religiously within thinking in only within the confines of their faith, they're not going to understand other perspectives. And so this is something that he was doing, right? He was trying to understand other people's perspectives, and he was a graduate of Yale, and he probably would have been taught a certain way, so this is probably something that he did on his own accord.
Right.
Which shows that he was a person of an independent conscience, right? He was questioning the establishment. And so this is something that I personally saw, and I started to look back in my own life, right? So I said, when I first read this passage, it shot many things into my mind. Firstly, I began to think about the intertwined nature of religion and the state in a place where those two things were supposed to be separate. The United States is supposed to separate religion from the state, right? That's just something that is core to the United States as a country.
Exactly.
However, right, in my mind, I was brought back to my days as a kid when I pledged allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And that in itself shows that, well, maybe these two things aren't separate, right?
Right.
There is this idea. They don't define who this God is, but it's definitely under him.
Yes.
And so I remembered saying those words every school day and being so excited when I was chosen to recite those words on the intercom for the whole school, because it showed a sense of patriotism, right?
Right.
I was happy to be an American. I was proud to be an American, and they would play the Bruce Springsteen
Especially
afterwards.
at that age. Yeah.
It was something I don't want to call it indoctrination, but I was certainly pro Pledge of Allegiance at that point. And so I started looking back, and I remembered saying that, but I was trying to think, did I understand what that meant when I was a kid, right? Did I understand those words,
I
the
definitely
meaning
didn't.
behind? And I said, yeah, I didn't either.
Right.
So it was something that I looked, and then I was like, man, this is. I'm thinking, but I started to think, well, I'm thinking like a kid, right? So I need to look at this as sort of the scholar that I am today, the person who questions history for what it is, and how it affects everybody. And I started to think that God, honor, and liberty, right? Like those things were so inseparable from the American conscience that you can't really claim to be an American if you don't think in this way, right? But that's something that they're trying to promote. Whereas I am not too sure if that's the case, right? This is America, but are we really supposed to use religion in this way? At least, well, they thought that way. We can see that, at least from William Livingston and other founding fathers definitely thought this way, because they made it so to put it into the Constitution, right? They made it so to put it into the Pledge of Allegiance, even though that probably came afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
But it was under those founding father principles, right? Those founding principles of the United States that things like this came into existence. And so he says a couple other things in terms of the idea that the youth can be taught a certain way if they are only taught to think within the confines of a certain religious sect or denomination. I've been using the word sect a lot. I probably should have been using denomination. But he says that a youthful mind is susceptible of almost any impression. Like the ductile wax, it receives the image of the seal without the least resistance. He also says that students not only receive the dogmata of their teachers with implicit faith, but are also constantly studying how to support them against every objection. And so in this, he's basically saying that, one, if they're going to be taught a certain way, they're going to try to promote that way for the rest of their life, because this is such an age where they're so impressionable to
Right.
ideas. And so it'll be hard to change that in the future. And he also doesn't want, one particular sect teaching, because they're going to try to teach them every particular way to combat anything outside of their established notions.
Exactly.
And so in this, I definitely agree with him, and I think in the end, his argument won out, because we have a College of Liberal Arts now where
Right.
we're taught to think differently, right? Like, I may be a history major, but I'm going into fields of politics, and I'm looking at that. I'm looking into fields of sociology. I'm looking
course.
into different cultural aspects, right? Like, I'm an Asian studies minor.
Right.
I have no descendants from Asia that I know of. Probably is there,
Maybe.
possibly. But I'm looking into that, right? It's showing that I'm willing to go outside of my preconceived, oh, I'm supposed to think this way, and I'm looking outside of that. And so in this, I think maybe he didn't win with Columbia in the beginning, but eventually his argument won out in the end.
There was a lot of struggle with schools in the beginning.
Yeah.
Like, Ben Franklin, the UPenn,
Yeah.
when he first started it, he did the same thing where he wanted the school to be taught in a way that goes outside of what the confines are. And unfortunately, after a while of it being like that, it was reverted back to just based on religion, the denomination. I think it was, I'm not sure what it was actually.
So, University of Pennsylvania may have been started by Quakers, because Quakers were I think the largest denomination in Pennsylvania.
Right. But the point is, like, it went back to that. So, like, there were brief moments of a win for those schools of thought, but
Yeah.
unfortunately, sometimes it didn't work out in the end.
Yeah, so
And it's definitely interesting. I mean, George Washington was saying all the same things as William Livingston was.
exactly. So it shows that they had a united front in a
Right.
sense. Like, they definitely didn't always agree with each other, but they believed in the core principles that
Right.
made up the United
It
States.
shows that this wasn't just one person. It was a group of people who all believed in this and were pushing to fight for it.
Exactly. And so I come away with a couple conclusions that if you took anything away from it, I would say that religion, though not officially tied to the state, played a very real role in the formation of this country, as well as that Livingston as an individual was someone who understood pluralism and how it could be beneficial to everybody, all parties, and that he is a symbol of tolerance in this period. And when I say tolerance, it's within a confines of certain aspects of faith, especially Protestant, right? That's within Protestantism. Okay, we can be tolerant, and this is something that is, I believe, a common trait that was probably wanted by a lot of people in the era of the Enlightenment in the United States.
Yes.
And so it makes him, in a sense, one of those persons that you can look at and be like, okay, he was one of those people.
Yeah, he was with it. So just like William Livingston had the ideas of pluralism in terms of religion, he also had it dictate how he behaves and acts in this society, along with other founding fathers. And that brings us to the ethical point of view, which is mainly in America during this time, it was libertarianism, which was freedom philosophy, that individuals should be free to do whatever they wish with their person or property, which is something that John Locke was huge about, freedom and property. So, and as long as these rights or their liberties did not infringe on the same liberties of others, it was okay.
Okay.
So, William Livingston and many of the other founding fathers all shared these common interests and these common themes about being able to do with their religion what they wanted to, with their education what they wanted to, and that dictated how they went about their lives. So basically, what it all boils down to, which was what interested me the most, was these important historical documents like the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and how they all play into the strive for the freedom philosophy and their ethics at the time, and how it also can be related to how they viewed points on slavery, which was a huge, huge issue, but no one really saw it as an ethical issue at the time.
And so I would say in this, right? So just in the same way as religious pluralism was targeted towards thinking differently in terms of different ideas in how religion dictated one's life or dictated their beliefs, I definitely see that there will be some pluralism in the way that people thought about slavery.
Right, because, I mean, it's interesting because really what it boils down to is that a lot of these founding fathers, like William Livingston, he's not really that known, but John Kane, in his letters that we were transcribing a couple weeks ago, it was interesting to see that he was against slavery in this letter, and he was like, okay, I'm going to free the slaves that I have, but they're going to get a piece of my inheritance only if they continue to work for my family.
Yeah.
So it's interesting how these ethics on slavery were trying to make it sound like they were doing a good thing.
Yeah.
But on the offhand, it was really kind of like, all right, I'm freeing you, but I'm freeing you into a world that's, has a deep hatred and racism. So it's kind of like, I'm freeing you, but where am I freeing you to, really?
Exactly.
So I'm still confined.
And that's like, so that's the thing with slavery. I think everybody in the current day will tell you that it's wrong, right?
Right.
But to them, they saw it as a means of living, right? That's how they made their money. That's how they did all those things. And so they may have espoused to certain ideals, right, to give them that freedom, right? Because maybe deep down they actually thought, maybe this institution isn't all as right as it is.
Maybe they were just trying to like assuage their guilt a little bit.
But at the end of the day, they thought, well, this is something that I need in order to even survive. Maybe.
Exactly.
This is what they subsisted off of. So it shows you that they may have had internal struggles to deal with about like what they were doing, but it still persisted.
Exactly. And to just backtrack a little bit, but because the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and even like the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments, which was the woman's right to vote, all played a key part in their moral philosophy or freedom philosophy for these founding people, fathers, because they felt as though they were being dictated on how to live their lives. So that's why they did a push for, the right to vote, the right to, or in the enslaved people's mind, the right to be free and be their own person and have citizenship. So it's just interesting to understand that though these founding fathers believed that slavery was inherently wrong, I mean, not all of them, but some of them, it was needed for their lifestyle, and thus making it easier to justify slavery, even though these historically important documents like the Declaration were the backbone of their country's creation. So it really just got me thinking about their part in the freedom philosophy or the moral philosophy of liberty and how it drove these founding fathers to obtain natural rights. So one of the most interesting things for me was, or that really got me thinking, was that William Livingston was part of the First and Second Continental Congress.
Yeah.
And, this is where we see other historically relevant people like Patrick Henry come up, who did his famous "I'm not a New Englander or Virginian, I am an American."
Yeah.
And he believed that Great Britain's unfair taxation was morally wrong because he and all of the other Americans were Englishmen, and now the government or the monarchy isn't in place to protect them. They're going against them. So, thus, the moral obligation to have this freedom.
And that's like one thing that you like really look at, and I think it goes back to the earlier thing that I was trying to get across, was that there may have been that established thinking that, okay, we are English subjects, English colonists, whatever you want to call them, and therefore we are subject to this idea of what it means to be English. And
Right.
so here we have individuals like Livingston and, as you mentioned, Patrick Henry, who are beginning to think outside of the confines of what everybody else has told them. Listen, this is reality. And they're questioning, like, what is it?
Right.
You know, we can be something else. We can be American.
Right.
Because they embody certain things that are different from what maybe I'm not going to say the average, but the main line of thinking would have thought an English colonist or an English subject would have had to aspire to be. They're thinking, oh no, I'm separate from that.
Exactly. And, that's the biggest part of enlightenment, is breaking free from that, I guess, what would you call it?
That preconceived
Yeah, the
notion,
preconceived notions. So it was definitely interesting reading about how these founding peoples of America were all having these same notions together against what, they were probably brought up with, learning and everything like that. But to go back, it was the Englishmen or Great Britain was no longer benefiting the Americans, even though they were technically Englishmen.
Yeah.
So, and even though Livingston, he wanted independence, he of course wanted independence, but he believed in having allies first and then independence later, which is actually took part in why he never signed the Declaration of Independence.
It would make sense because at that point they were making a statement like, no, we want independence on our terms.
And we want it right now.
Right now, yeah.
So,
It was definitely, it was a statement.
Yeah, it was definitely a statement. So he never signed it, and then there was also other frustrations during his time as the governor of New Jersey. He was actually unable, he tried to abolish slavery, but he was unable to do it. He did it multiple times, and he did this because he knew it was wrong, but he was also stuck between like his family's want for slavery and his own personal beliefs that he actually states that slavery is an indelible blot upon humanity, so it can never be removed. It's right there. It's an awful part of humanity now, and you see him kind of in this statement struggling with, well, I believe in the ethical philosophy of a satisfied living or a good living, which would result in him having slaves, and then struggling with the fact that it's wrong. I know it's wrong. I shouldn't do it. So it is contradictory and a little hypocritical of him.
Yeah, no, I can definitely see that, and maybe he's likening it to something that is undoubtedly evil but necessary.
Right.
And though that idea in itself is wrong, this was what he was seeing around him, and I think in the sense that he's trying to think outside of his sphere, he has to come to terms with that this has existed for a period, and this is America. This is what America is built upon, is this idea that slavery exists and we need it in order to progress, right?
Right.
It's something that is there, and he doesn't have, like, even if he's trying to think that, okay, we can change this, he doesn't really see it as changing.
Right.
So it's an institution.
Exactly.
Something that's there to stay. And he can't think differently.
Right, and you see that struggle because some of these early ethical beliefs was that, humans are selfish, like we said before, and they will strive to put their own personal interests above anything else. So that's kind of what we see here with Livingston's ethical reasoning of satisfied living or good living. which is how he justifies slavery in his own terms. And yeah, so really to just conclude everything, we have, Livingston believing in this pluralism and believing in his need and America's need to break free from what was the general consensus at the time. And you can see how that governs and dictates how he also comes to his reasoning or his ethics in regards to aspects such as personal liberty and freedom.
Yeah, no, I can definitely see that.
Right. And it's definitely been an interesting research to see the contradictions, the struggles.
Yeah, the research is, I think, the very interesting part about this, because it's hard to try to put yourself into the mind of, I'm not going to call him a slaver, but something that is just so far off from you that you couldn't even imagine yourself doing, right? Like, and to try to reason with it, right? Not justify his actions, but just come to terms with why he may have done them.
Right.
And not say that they were right or not, but to understand it.
Exactly.
And so in this process, I think it's definitely been interesting to understand that there was a religious component,
mm-hmm.
and there was also an ethical component that went into it, in that they were, although they were thinking outside the box, they had some preconceived notions and maybe built on top of that.
Right.
And I think that embodies a lot of the American Enlightenment.
Yes.
And so changing what was already there and adding on to it. And I think that was, in seeing that process of the research, right?
Right.
That was something that I enjoyed a lot.
So do you think that America is still going through an enlightenment?
Currently, that's up for debate. But
Right.
that's a podcast for another time.
All right. So as we bring this to a close, we sincerely hope that you enjoyed our perspectives and found this conversation interesting. We want to thank you, the viewer, for watching, as well as, again, thanking everyone who gave us this opportunity to talk about these subjects. If you'd like to learn more about William Livingston and his role in America's Enlightenment, we ask that you visit the William Livingston's World website, directed by Doctors Elizabeth Hyde and Jonathan Mercantini, which we will leave a link down in the description. We will also link Jeffrey's previous podcast on Livingston and slavery, where you can find further information and more exceptional works from faculty and students who have looked into the life and times surrounding William Livingston. We hope you enjoyed. Thanks. Goodbye.